न सद्वासद्यदपि परमं वेदवातन्न वेद यत् सत्यं तन्न खलु कुशलैश्छिद्यते तर्कबाणैः द्वैताद्वैतात्यखिलमतिभिर्यत्पदं सेव्यते तत् वन्दे चेतो विलयनिलयं शारदापादपद्मम् सांख्यं योगं पशुपतिमतं वैष्णवं वा यथेच्छं चार्वाकं वा भवतु हृदयाह्लादकं सज्जनानां यत् सत्यं तत् प्रमितिपथगं स्वप्रकाशं वरेण्यं दद्याच्छौख्यं जगति सकलं darshanam sharadaya. Thank you so much and welcome everybody to Vimarsha. Your presence means a lot to me and for the future of Vimarsha. For a rational discourse, we need scholars having the freedom to explore the zenith of their rationality. At the same time, we seek to expand the horizon of what experiential modes of teachings from the rishis can teach us for our times. Born and raised in different cultural environment and trained in very complex global context, I myself am pursuing what resonates my own life, how to integrate the practices that my masters shared with me with great love, with the same rigor and the same rational approach that my gurus and pandits have had during my training. And Vimarsha is a dream. Vimarsha is a vision to make this real. And I deeply appreciate scholars being part of this. Professor Loriliai Biernacki, who is a professor in religious studies at the University of Colorado at Boulder, has encouraged me in many ways than I can remember in the last 22 years of our acquaintance. Her research interests include medieval Sanskrit texts, the subtle body, Indian philosophy, new materialism, gender, and the interface between religion and science. She is currently working on neuroscientific models of body-mind connection, including integrated information theory. Her first book, Renowned Goddess of Desire, Woman, Sex, and Speech in Tantra, published from Oxford in 2007, won the Caden Award in 2008. She is co-editor of God's Body, Panentheism Across the World Religious Traditions, published again by Oxford in 2013. Her most recent work, The Matter of Wonder, Abhinavagupta's Panentheism and New Materialism by Oxford in 2023, is on the writings of the medieval Indian mystic and philosopher Abhinavagupta and their relevance for a contemporary science and new materialism. Professor Biernacki will guide us today on how an 11th century yogi can help a new materialism make sense of our information craze. Thank you, Professor Biernacki. We are humble of your presence. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor Timalsina, for that lovely, lovely introduction. It's always really a pleasure to sort of hang out with such an elevated yogi as you are, and also a deep scholar. So it's a rare sort of quality that you have, and a rare and wonderful opportunity that I always relish whenever I have it, to sort of get to spend some time with you. So I'm going to start a PowerPoint, but first I think I should do one short mantra invocation of Lord Ganesha. Om Vakratanda Mahakaya Koti Surya Samaprabha Nirvignam Kuruve Deva Sarva Sarveshu Sarva Vigneshu Sarvada. I had to do that again properly, but okay. Okay, let me share my PowerPoint here. How do I share my PowerPoint? Let me see.
You should be able to click share screen.
Okay, here we go. Thank you. How is this? Does this work?
Yes,
yeah, we can see it. Just click the present button and you should be good.
Okay.
Perfect.
Okay, here we go. So how an 11th century yogi can help a new materialism make sense of our information craze. So let me so here are a couple of epigraphs that we'll be showing here. Abhinavagupta says, the person who is said to be liberated is someone who correctly understands other beings to be like one's own limbs. And then one from Richard Dawkins, who says, if you want to understand life, don't think about the vibrant, throbbing gels and oozes. Think about information technology. And then also, Abhinavagupta has a wonderful quote here. The state of being an object is just a quality of consciousness. That shadow cannot cover over consciousness. And then also one from the scientist, quantum physicist John Archibald Wheeler, using such and such equipment, making such and such a measurement, I get such and such a number. Who I am has nothing to do with this finding, or does it? Am I sleepwalking, or am I one of those poor souls without the critical power to save himself from pathological science? Okay, so these are my epithets, and so we'll get started now. So Charles Darwin famously rejected God in a pithy, if pessimistic, arraignment of nature's cruelty, saying, I cannot persuade myself that a beneficent and omnipotent God would have designedly created the Ichmonidae with the express intention of their feeding within the living bodies of caterpillars. The cruel Ichmonidae wasp injects its eggs into the caterpillar so that as it matures, the wasp larva slowly eats away from the inside the live womb of the caterpillar's body, finally nightmarishly bursting it apart. The idea of an enemy within, a wasp taking over the hapless caterpillar from the inside, violating the body's boundaries against the will of the body's proper owner, strikes Darwin as too sinister to countenance. And indeed, it's the stuff of horror movies, evoking images from the movie Alien with the strange, ugly creature bursting out of Cain's chest. It forces us to realize that living beings are not discrete individuals. We are porous. An implosion from within makes this all too apparent. I have a hunch that this is horrifying to Darwin, causes him to lose faith in God, because the analogy too readily applies to our own fiction of autonomous individual selves. We humans are not little mini-me versions of a biblical God, made in his image, discrete and sovereign in our own bodies, but instead susceptible to takeover and implosion. But perhaps Charles Darwin was too hasty in rejecting God. Whether God, whatever that might be, has a say or not, the parasitic wasp, as it turns out, may not be such an evil character after all. Or in any case, only from the perspective of the dying caterpillar is the parasitic wasp, or the God who designed it, a villain. From the perspective of the lima bean plants attacked by caterpillars, these apparently wretched wasps turn out to be heroes, plant protectors that scientists have dubbed plant bodyguards. A variety of species, including corn and lima beans, send out a chemical emission, information, a pheromone-like distress signal when attacked by caterpillars. The parasitic wasp smells the scent of the plant's dismay and comes to the rescue, destroying the invading caterpillars. The parasitic wasp, emblematic of Darwin's loss of faith, nevertheless plays a wider, kinder role in the ecology of life and death on the side of plants who have no way to flee marauding insects. But then what does it mean that these lima beans can somehow communicate with these wasps, sending a smelly Morse code message, information, chemically wafting across the distance? What does this secret chemical sharing of goals, of survival, might we even say cross-species love between a lima bean and a wasp say about what it means to be a lima bean plant or a parasitic wasp? Does it suggest that the plant has a kind of consciousness and agency? In the wake of our ecological maelstrom, polluted water and soil, new materialism as an emerging field proposes that we take seriously the agency of the non-human participants, insects and plants and matter, lima beans and wasps of our world. This paper suggests that part of how we got here, our ecological crisis, has to do with the way we think of the world in terms of information. Our current biology chalks this transfer of information from lima bean to wasp down to an evolutionary algorithm, sophisticated, but still the rote transfer of information. This information exchange, our science says, in no way indicates consciousness on the part of the plant or wasp. Yet, this strange alliance provokes at least a pause. What indeed is information? Information as a concept, I would venture, is attractive for a current perspective in large part because it proposes, with a scalpel precision, to slice out from knowledge its fuzzy first-person element, leaving us with an idea of information as something we can measure, something we can manipulate, something external. A contemporary scientific discourse tends to leave out of the notion of information the subjective element of the one who knows. Somehow the veneer of authority attaches to the third person, making it more universal, more true. Yet, if we excavate the concept of information, I propose that what makes it so powerful as a concept is instead precisely that it offers a bivalency. Yes, of course, information functions as external, third-person material, and hence measurable and manipulable. However, even as the idea of information trades on the impetus to measure and manipulate knowledge, embedded in our cultural construction of the concept of information is an implicit, mostly unacknowledged backdoor embrace of the first-person perspective, of the intentionality and meaning of the subject who knows. I argue that the 11th century Indian Abhinavagupta's articulation of a foundational subjectivity, a first-person perspective, the subject who knows, can help a current new materialism parse out how the concept of information works for us and helps us to rethink the model on which it is founded. What I present here comes from my book, The Matter of Wonder, Abhinavagupta's Panentheism and New Materialism. Drawing selections from the 5th chapter, we will look at information through the lens of Abhinavagupta's thought, comparing mathematical ideas of information to a mantra and thinking through the implications of information with physicist John Wheeler's famous analysis of matter as coming from information, what he dubbed it from bit. I offer these comparisons not to suggest an analogy of mantras to information and the like, but rather to tease out some of the unarticulated ramifications of these models. What these comparisons highlight is that the path winds its way back towards the back door, towards the recovery of meaning, of information as meaning, as a first-person perspective. So then, what does a transmission of information signify in terms of sender and recipient? Does it point to some ghost behind the machinery of plant and wasp biochemistry? Or is there nothing more than a bald, unconscious biological algorithm? Our familiar anthropocentric prioritization of our own species' modes of communication leaves us allergic to granting anything like a mindful connection, a literal compassion between a lima bean and lowly insect. Hence, we chalk it up to pulls of an evolutionary adaptation, lucky and accidental. This is, for instance, precisely what a compelling thinker like Daniel Dennett points to as Darwin's great idea, evolution without a corresponding mindfulness. Then, is information fundamentally mindless? The idea of information plays a central role in most, if not all, of our contemporary models for the world that we inhabit. It has become a unifying concept across disciplines, ubiquitous. I think Rosie Braidotti gets at the heart of what drives the turn to information. She marks this as a shift from an idea of meaning into information, which is lifeless, a shift from the humanities as perspective to the objectivity of a third-person science. Jeff Kripal, as well, has pointed to this cultural turn driving the way we render the differences between the sciences and the humanities. Also, perhaps in part, the allure of the idea of information lies in its promises of a mathematical transcendence. Information, from a physics perspective, is never lost. This profound physical immutability was put to the test in the famous bet between Stephen Hawking and John Preskill over whether information is lost if it falls into a black hole. Hawking conceded the bet, and Riley commented that he should have paid his wager an encyclopedia of baseball as ashes, the information out of which Preskill could still retrieve. Information is never lost. It may not always be readily accessible, but nevertheless, it remains as traces. For our purposes, oddly like the theory of traces that karma leaves minutely encoded in the fabric of subtle bodies. And curiously, just as with the theory of karma and rebirth, so information's immutability also holds out hope against the cruel mortality of human bodies, that at least our consciousness, if not our bodies, might transcend the inevitable return to dust. The hope for a more eternal existence that information seems to promise appears to be behind Ray Kurzweil's digital dreams of immortality through downloading his consciousness into a computer. Information is never lost. With the right engineering and technology, Kurzweil's essence, his consciousness, can be downloaded as information, immortality through ones and zeros. It is not surprising, then, that the idea of information as ordering principle has also crept into the idea, the problem of consciousness. So apart from the pervasiveness of metaphors comparing the human brain to a computer, information as an organizing pattern has also become a prominent way of thinking about consciousness itself. As Douglas Hofstadter pronounced in his enticing Gödel, Escher, Bach, the key is not the stuff out of which brains are made, but the patterns that can come to exist out of the stuff of a brain. More recently, Max Tegmark has also adopted this language of information, computations, and patterns. In a recent TED Talk, he equates consciousness with computation and tells us consciousness is a mathematical pattern. The same molecules from a physics level can be conscious or not, depending on the pattern it takes. So there's just one sort of stuff in the universe. This is a monism, quarks and atoms. It's how it gets arranged, its information pattern, that determines whether it is consciousness, whether it's conscious or not. This is the sort of obverse of monism that we find. Sorry about this. This is a sort of obverse of the monism that we find in Indian religious traditions, and interesting for our purposes, surprisingly quite close to the dictum we find across much Tantra. The idea that everything, in fact, has the nature of all things. That is, there's one reality, Shiva, and it takes a variety of forms, some conscious and some not. What makes the difference has not to do with the basic substance of this or that thing or entity, but rather how matter instantiates different mathematical patterns for Tegmark and for Abhinavagupta, how it instantiates different concentrations of subjectivity. The question is then, is consciousness simply the particular pattern a material information takes? What is so interesting about Tegmark's formulations, which not surprisingly also align with some contemporary neuroscientists studying consciousness. Here, I'm referring to Tononi and Koch's understanding of information in their Integrated Information Theory, IIT 3.0, which shifts our cultural's dominant scientific model, a bare physicalist materialism that says only matter really exists, into a dual aspect monism that includes space for the murky concept of consciousness. Tegmark's consciousness as a mathematical pattern, his dual aspect model, is similar to Tononi's dual aspect model for consciousness, and also to Abhinavagupta's dual aspect monism. That is, for Tegmark, consciousness is the way information feels. I'll give you this one again. This is key because with this assertion, Tegmark ties into information a bivalency, affording it at the same time both the third person, measurable objective status of matter, and the first person subjectivity of consciousness. The quantitative objective elements of information, the patterns of atoms arranged as a bottle or a hand or a bat, mark one aspect, the objective physical existence. Its inner subjectivity, what it feels like to be a bat or a bottle, marks the other half of this dual aspect monism. Tegmark's model is congruent with Abhinavagupta's dual aspect monism, where idanta, the thisness, marks the objective external marker of his dual aspect non-dualism, things that are just dead or insentient objects, and ahanta, I-ness, points to the subjective internal marker. Now, as it happens sometimes with speculations on consciousness, Tegmark's remarks in this talk also begin to sound the notes of a transcendence bordering on mysticism. He tells us some mathematical patterns simply are conscious. But what does it mean to say a mathematical pattern is conscious? The seeming mysticism of Tegmark's remarks calls to mind a passage in Abhinavagupta. If we allow a comparison of the formula of a mantra with a formula of a mathematical pattern, in the passage, Abhinava talks about the difference between the subjectivity of a mantra, which has a body made of sound, but not the other elements, earth, water, fire, in contrast to the subjectivity of a person with a body like yours and mine, consisting of earth, and so on. If it sounds odd to impute consciousness to a mantra, as it sounds odd to impute consciousness to a mathematical formula, we should keep in mind that for this Indian tradition, what makes gods different from humans is precisely that their bodies are primarily made of sound and not the other elements. This is sound as vibratory frequency, so not simply gross physical sound, but something more like a vibratory formula. Thus, I should have given you this one. Thus, in a popular song to the goddess of wealth, Lakshmi, the poet sings, "Your eternal body is the mantra, O goddess." The body made of just sound alone has a kind of staying capacity that bodies made of earth cannot quite match. In Abhinavagupta's analysis, the problem with the physical body, which includes here also the intellect, is that it is too easily understood as an object, what he calls thisness or idanta. To this, Abhinava says that the physical body, including the intellect and the breath, he says these are not, in fact, at all like the form which sound takes when it is perceived. The physical body, etc., cause consciousness to contract, to become limited. They cover and obscure consciousness very tightly indeed. In contrast, the body which sound takes when it manifests, which is essentially what mantra is, this embodiment of sound continually reverberates as Vimarsha, the essence of life, sentience in the sky of the heart. Here, for Abhinava, bodies made of sound connected to ether the most refined of the 5 elements do not carry the liabilities of our usual physical bodies, causing consciousness to become obscured as bodies made of the other 4 elements, bodies of earth and water, do. This occurs because sound connected to space is special among the 5 sensory qualities of sight, touch, and so on. Sound is foundationally connected to meaning. Abhinava tells us, sound, which is word, is the ability to give meaning. It has the nature of nada, primordial sound vibration, and it has the capacity to give space to all things. This sound at base is the seed of the host of the various letters, and the basic function of it is to endure the variety of meanings conventionally imposed upon sounds, from which it therefore possesses the ability to be imposed upon various objects as their meaning. This is one type of sound. The other type is the word, or let it not be considered a word, denoting something, even the onomatopoetic sound of rapping. That type of sound has the capacity to endure all space without the accompanying contact because it lacks form and it does not create resistance through contact. Utpaladeva describes that sound with the words having the nature of primordial sound vibration. Because sound is connected to space, it carries with it the capacity to give space to all things. Sound gives rise to the alphabet, the basis of language, and allows meaning to arise in relation to the different objects we encounter. Sound also creates meaning simply by its own capacity to endure space. This primordial sound vibration, which, as Abhinava says, which is a word, or Abhinava tells us, even just the sound of rapping, by its inherent nature, generates meaning. I suspect that here he suggests something akin to our evolutionary predisposition to recognize patterns of sound as meaningful. We impute intention to sounds. The rapping on the window, as Edgar Allan Poe discerned, tells us someone is there, person or raven or ghost. The other 4 elements, earth, water, fire, and air, lack this capacity. Abhinava tells us the earth, etc., so far as it goes, do not have the capacity to make space at all whatsoever. Even visibly, it is not the inherent nature of these, earth, water, fire, and air, to give space. They only perform this function when the ether or space accompanies them. That is, the gross or physical element of ether, akasha, with its accompanying subtle element of sound, has a special capacity to make space, and this capacity is what allows meaning to emerge. So ether or space is considered to be a physical element. However, sound itself, as a subtle element, has an additional feature, a stirring up quality, which is what allows the influx of meaning to occur with sound. Whether we like, so I'm not going to go through this quote here, but it's another course where he talks about sound having this capacity. Whether we can liken sound and mantric sound to the idea of information or not, what they share is a dual configuration linking a material quality to the idea of meaning. So this is what's so important about this idea of sound and space as opposed to all the other 4 elements, and that is that it's the one element that can link meaning to matter. And this is extremely important. And what I'm arguing elsewhere is that this is exactly how neuroscientists like Tononi and Koch and other scientists working on integrated information theory, IIT 3.0, this is how they bridge this sort of the hard problem. The problem is how do you connect mind to matter? This is how they bridge it. And Abhinavagupta came up with this idea really much earlier. And he links it to this notion of sound connected to matter, because meaning connects to this materiality through the idea of space and sound. Okay, and of course, the terminology used for information today as well invokes the idea of sound, with technical terms like noise and signal. In any case, sound carries one other ramification, a perk to be enjoyed for those beings made of sound like gods, or perhaps mathematical formulas, if some indeed might be conscious, as Max Tegmark suggests. That is, Abhinava tells us the highest level the Maya-bound subjects in the body can attain, etc., is the state of bondage, because all the bound souls are innately afraid of the body breaking down. Okay, so what does that mean? It means being in a body made of earth carries an innate downside. The body can break down, and those of us with earth and water bodies, we know this on a visceral level, and it generates a deep-seated fear within us that keeps us bound, stuck in unenlightened thought patterns. This is not the case for those beings who exist on a higher, more conscious level than us, who instead take bodies made of sound, made of the collections of letters that make up mantras. Just like the quote that I gave earlier, where the song to the goddess Lakshmi says, "Oh goddess Lakshmi, your body is actually made of sound, of mantra." So bodies made of mantric sound seem to offer immunity to breaking down, and this is much like the information that Ray Kurzweil hopes to capture in his quest for robot immortality. Perhaps, after all, mantra bodies and information bodies are the bodies made of sound. Now, ultimately, I don't think that Kurzweil's on the right track with this. Okay, just I want to make that clear. But the idea that he's trying to get at is that he can obtain immortality simply through information. And this is what we see in the Sanskrit text as well, i.e. the idea of mantra. Now, what people like Kurzweil lack is that they don't seem to be aware that they're actually, the only way they can do this is to do it as Abhinava did it, which is to bring it back to the notion of meaning. Okay, I suggest similarities by this analogy of information to mantric sound. However, this is by no means to equate the two. Simply, the analogy is suggestive, and as such, it helps to contextualize the perhaps not so surprising genealogy, the lines of connection between non-dualist philosophies from the Indian subcontinent and contemporary formulations of information. For instance, the pioneering quantum physicist Schrödinger was attracted to Hinduism's non-dual Advaita Vedanta. And Christoph Koch, a contemporary neuroscientist, also points to the mysticism of Tibetan Buddhism to get at an idea of what he calls pure consciousness. Also more Buddhist-friendly, Thomas Metzinger, arguing for this notion of no self, recently suggests that ideas of the soul founded on out-of-body experiences may also be linked to an idea of information. So Metzinger tells us the soul is the out-of-body experience phenomenal self-model. Centuries of phenomenological reports describing it as a subtle body pointed in the right direction. And now we can begin to see how it actually is a purely informational structure, modeling bodily self-experience in cases of absent or disintegrated somatosensory vestibular input. Okay, so does that sound like jargon trying to sort of explain away a subtle body? Okay, maybe. The experience of leaving the body, popularly known as astral travel, traveling outside the body via a soul or a subtle body, is, as Metzinger tells us, simply linked to the material brain's capacities for modeling information in its somatosensory cortex. It is also probably fair to say that some of the mystically laced talk, at least in part, arises through information's link to post-Newtonian quantum physics, its sheer incomprehensibility. Jeff Kripal as well astutely points to the close link between the language and ideas of quantum mechanics and a contemporary articulation of conceptions of out-of-body and subtle body experiences. In any case, Richard Feynman's oft-quoted quip that if you think you understand quantum mechanics, you don't understand quantum mechanics, iconically captures the enigma of this new physics. The law of the excluded middle, so famously invoked derisively against the mystical philosophy of India, becomes slippery in the face of quantum mechanics, uncanny recalcitrance to the kinds of positivist logic that held sway for these last 3 recent centuries of Western science. Okay, so I'm going to talk here now about John Wheeler and his notion of it from bit, how you get matter from information. So the shearing point of this comparison has to do with the idea of information and its backdoor reclamation of meaning. I suggest here a comparison of Abhinava's 11th century non-dual panentheism with theoretical quantum physicist John Wheeler's conception of information in Wheeler's well-known postulation of, quote, it from bit, as a way of elucidating this back door. Wheeler's pithy formulation, it from bit, nicely conjures the shift in thinking that quantum mechanics precipitates, encapsulating the idea of information as key to what reality really is. Wheeler says, it from bit symbolizes the idea that every item of the physical world has at bottom, at a very deep bottom, in most instances, an immaterial source and explanation. That what we call reality, and here he means especially material reality, the matter of the world, what we call reality arises in the last analysis from the posing of yes-no questions in the registering of equipment-evoked responses. In short, that all things physical are information theoretic in origin, and that this is a participatory universe. Wheeler's postulations in this seminal talk turn on its head our usual Newtonian assumptions about the world. It is not the case that science can innocently, objectively, from the outside, from the third person, examine the world and describe how it is made, how it works, or how it works. Instead, Wheeler suggests that the basis, the origin of matter, is something not at all material, not atoms or quarks building up to generate a world, which then evolves into life and into conscious beings. Rather, Wheeler tells us that the source begins with information, with the bit, as its very deep bottom, its immaterial source. When queried, this immaterial information gives rise to the physical world. The world arises through observer participation, through a subject, a person, a first person, asking questions, which register answers that generate the material stuff, the matter of the universe that is the it. With this, Wheeler guides his information theoretic into strange territory as he invokes non-human possibilities for awareness, computer consciousness, and who knows what, telling us, what shall we say of an existence that appears, if not anthropomorphic in its use of the word who, still overly centered on life and consciousness? Wheeler's interpretation of information as a quantum phenomena causes a rupture in business as usual for thinking about the nature of matter, and sets the stage for much current thinking about information, including the position that Tononi and Koch take by adopting a panpsychism to help explain the gap between matter and consciousness, the gap between mind and body. Wheeler's use of information as an immaterial source and primary base for creation of the objects in the world shares with Abhinavagupta the idea of a flow from an originary non-physical source to generate physical matter. For Abhinava, the movement is from subject as consciousness to object. Physical matter arises from the subject, which is at base awareness or consciousness. So Abhinava tells us the subject's form, which is a unity of awareness, contains an excess, an abundance of awareness. This is deposited into the side of the object that is going to be created. So inwardly, the object has the attribute of Shakti, energy, which is none other than the form of consciousness. Matter, all materiality, takes the form of objects of third-person existence. Objects are the matter that flow outwardly from the subject. That is, matter doesn't exist separately from the subject. And they retain within their core the element of consciousness, even as it is covered over, even as it remains hidden. Abhinava links this as well to his dual aspect panentheism in his use of the binary of knowledge and action, jnana and kriya. Knowledge represents an inward direction, and action as the outward movement towards externality links it to matter. For our purposes, two things are particularly interesting about Abhinava's formulation of how objects in the world relate to the subject who apprehends them. First, like Wheeler, he sees the process as extending first from the level of an indeterminate, non-physical source as consciousness first, which then becomes the object as physical matter. It from bit. So it from bit for Abhinava could be written in an English-Sanskrit linguistic hybrid as it from chit. That is, chit is the Sanskrit translation of for consciousness. So Wheeler says consciousness arises from information, it from bit is information. I say for Abhinava, we could say consciousness matter, the it arises from chit, from consciousness. In other words, for Abhinava, matter arises out of consciousness. Of course, the difference between a bit and chit really boils down to whether there is meaning, intentionality, that is, consciousness behind Wheeler's immaterial theoretic, that is information. Secondly, Abhinava stipulates consciousness as a first-person perspective behind the transfer and transformation of knowledge, that is the bit or consciousness chit, an idea of knowledge that I'm loosely aligning to a notion of information here. Again, this first-person perspective exists apart from human minds. We will not yet here, but later return to our lima bean and wasp with their own curious transfer of knowledge and whether this implies a who, that is, a subjectivity behind the transfer of information. Wheeler, for his part, is quite reticent in his speculations on how consciousness might play into the mix. He acknowledges that his model of the what he calls an information theoretic seems to point like a smoking gun towards the idea of consciousness. So Wheeler tells us, consciousness, we have traveled what may seem a dizzying path. First, elementary quantum phenomenon brought to a close by an irreversible act of amplification. Second, the resulting information expressed in the form of bits. Third, this information, these bits, used by observer participants via communication to establish meaning. Fourth, from the past through the millenniums to come, so many observer participants, so many bits, so much exchange of information as to build what we call existence. Certainly, measurement and measurement expressed as information bits, and then this information communicated to establish meaning. And out of this, from Wheeler, we get the material world. What he says, what we call existence, the it from bit. Yet what consciousness is, or the role it might play in the process, is one that he hesitates to define. He continues this passage, pointing out how precipitously close his theory swerves towards postulating a primary consciousness at the base of everything. In fact, the panpsychism, this is the same as the panpsychism that Tononi and Koch and Tegmark eventually take up in his wake. So Wheeler doesn't quite, he can't make that step. Psychologically, I think, is what's preventing him from making the step. But what he says here, he says is, doesn't this it from bit view of existence seek to elucidate the physical world about which we know something in terms of an entity about which we know almost nothing, that is consciousness. Yet he quickly shuts down this tantalizing opening into the idea of consciousness. A few lines down, he writes, we, however, steer clear of the issues connected with consciousness. Okay, and we should note that, again, neuroscientists like Tononi and his colleagues and Chris Koch, and also mathematicians and physicists like Max Tegmark, they do not steer clear. They actually come up with the panpsychism, which brings consciousness back to the basic level. Okay, so Wheeler dodges what he points to as the natural and logical conclusion of his own idea of information, that is, an idea of intentionality or meaning as the foundation. He recognizes this when he points to consciousness as the base, even if he subsequently shuts down this line of thought, telling us he will, quote, steer clear of the issues connected with consciousness. I suspect that driving this rejection is at least in part a desire to stick with a third-person perspective, that is, a notion of objectivity, in order to bypass the inevitable subjectivity that comes with intentionality and with meaning. This, again, is the point that Rosie Braidotti and Kreipel make about the idea of information. Wheeler seems to want to stay away from a notion of the personal, of an intentional agency, an agency that looks a little too much like a creator God as the immaterial source of this creation. Information as a concept and as a word, with its connotations of abstractness and the impersonal, accomplishes this. It may be possible to think of information simply as molecularly patterned organization, as Ray Kurzweil does, but I suspect that the attractiveness of information as a model is precisely its capacity to entail meaning, to entail intentionality, the mental and subjective elements of the experience of the, quote, what it feels like, as we saw Tegmark highlight. And this is ultimately what Ray Kurzweil wants as well also. This is the back door. This is the back door that information offers. This is certainly the case for Tononi and Koch's integrated information theory 3.0 and the necessary slide they take into panpsychism. And I would also venture for Wheeler as well. What information means, even for Wheeler, as steering clear of the C word, consciousness, what he means is precisely meaning. As he tells us, and it's a quote from Wheeler, he says, it is to establish meaning. Meaning which can also be made material and hence measured. But meaning, doesn't this really look like swapping out the pot for the kettle? Meaning, measured or not, in any case, requires a subject, a conscious entity to make that meaning, to have things make sense. Meaning is for Wheeler what links information, its many measurable bits, to the millenniums of participant observers in a virtuous and repeated cycle of communication of this meaning to then make a world. As Wheeler puts it, so many observer participants, so many bits, so much exchange of information to build what we call existence. It from bit, information made into matter all around us. Perhaps we might imagine these millenniums of bits and their participant observers as akin to the algorithms of AI machine learning. The vast repetitions of data, its sheer excess of millenniums, enough to allow a slow instantiation of matter out of its so many bits honed in on by a number of crunching machinery to give us chat GPT, etc. Nothing godlike here, just a blind Darwinian algorithmic inexorability. This looks like Wheeler's interpretation in any case, as he tells us, henceforth, let us absolve consciousness from the charge of magic. Let us recognize it as a rational part of the biochemical electronic machinery of the world. So we have it. Consciousness arises simply out of biochemical electronic machinery. Still, however, we find ourselves left with what to make of the meaning of meaning. Information or consciousness as mere machinery seems to miss a salient punchline. Meaning for who? As John Nemec points out, for the 9th to 10th century Somananda, Abhinavagupta's great-grand teacher, Perception itself requires a person with a mind, with intentions. Somananda says, perception would not arise for someone who has no will, i.e., for one who is devoid of intentions, because he would not be guided by the mind. Will is nothing but cognition imbued with one's intentions. Cognition, information, is not simply free-floating. It is attached to a perspective with its own intention, its own will, and its own subjectivity. In short, the suggestion for this medieval understanding is that the very nature of cognition entails some sort of intentional entity behind the gathering of information. Is it a person, if only in Viveros de Castro's sense? Physicist and new materialist Karen Barad astutely points to the slippage here, pointing out that the physicist Schrodinger's conclusion confirms that measurement is about, and this is the famous Schrodinger experiment, the cat is a dead or alive experiment. And so Karen Barad, the physicist, she says that Schrodinger tells us measurement is about subjectivity. Along these same lines, Abhinava gets to the heart of the problem of meaning through a radical idea, at least radical for our current perspective on matter. Abhinava argues that causality can only be connected to a living, conscious subjectivity. We use the notion of cause and effect to measure material changes. That's what we do with our science. In other words, it is about matter, not about consciousness. This bedrock of scientific objectivity, the notion of cause and effect, is precisely what quantum physics disrupts. Its participant observers inevitably blurring the lines of causality, interjecting the intentions of the observer into matter by the very act of observing, bringing the subject back in. Abhinava's dual aspect non-dualism likewise points precisely to the intrusion of a conscious subject in any formulation of cause and effect. A conscious, sentient subject is always at the heart of cause and effect. Thus, as Abhinava tells us, it cannot be proved that the relation of cause and effect is grounded within that which lacks sentience. Rather, the relation of cause and effect lies only with that which is conscious. Now here, Abhinava reworks the Samkhya philosophy that he inherits, and he goes against it. He reworks it to allow the possibility for consciousness, that is, that which is sentient, to have an effect upon the world. He radically departs from the idea of consciousness that we find in Samkhya, where the Purusha, a pristine consciousness, safeguards its claim to being real and permanent by divorcing it from material reality. This is the philosophical impetus for this point Abhinava makes. What it does is to recognize the inevitable intrusion of consciousness into any transaction that happens in the world. This is what the physicist, John Wheeler, and his cohorts tell us about the participant observation element of quantum mechanics, that there is an inevitable intrusion of consciousness into any transaction that happens within matter in the world. That is, Abhinava's model entails a participatory universe, even as his own reasoning is simply a philosophical response to Samkhya's divide between matter and consciousness. Consciousness, the intentions of a who, exist behind the changes that we see in matter. Abhinava's position is radical for our own positivist understanding of matter and causality, and it suggestively and substantively bolsters a contemporary new materialism, where matter and its modifications are imbued throughout with consciousness and sentience. In terms of our earlier question of meaning for who, we should keep in mind that even to speak of cause and effect implies a particular perspective, one particular subjectivity, singling out this or that salient factor as cause in the midst of a multiplicity of simultaneously occurring cofactors. The idea of causality implies a directed intention, it implies a subject, it implies a who. Cause and effect, like meaning, entails the who behind the cause, perceiving the cause. Wheeler, it appears, intuits this as well, coming back to the question of consciousness and substituting for the C word the idea of meaning to fill in the gaps between bits and matter and participant observer effects in a quantum universe. By way of contrast, the Sankhya model locates cause and effect just like our contemporary positivism, our contemporary non-quantum physics. Sankhya locates cause and effect in the world of matter alone. The problem that comes from this is, of course, a familiar one, akin to Descartes' Cartesian bifurcation, which leaves no way to connect consciousness to the body and matter. When Abhinava says that cause and effect must be located within what is conscious, sentient, he bridges the gap, linking consciousness with the body and matter. So Abhinava has solved the hard problem. Meaning is then intrinsic to matter. Meaning intrinsic to matter. This bears repeating. It offers a handier grip on the issue at stake than the more widely familiar panpsychic idea of consciousness intrinsic to matter. The abstractness of this idea of the word and the idea of consciousness tends to keep us in a third-person perspective, while the idea of meaning brings the idea of a particular perspective, a first-person awareness front and center, especially for a new materialism. This shift to think about matter in terms of meaning opens up avenues for re-articulating its status. The idea that matter has at base a kind of intentionality is radically counter to our positivist understandings about the difference between mind and matter. Causality is not simply a change in one material variable or another leading to an effect. It entails meaning. It entails intention. The corollary is that any idea of a self, permanent or not, that is not able to have a causal effect on matter, like the Samkhya Purusha that Abhinavagupta criticizes, this notion that does not have an effect, which stands apart from matter in a pristine, eternal existence, unable to impact the body, such a self is irrelevant. In other words, the Samkhya Purusha is irrelevant. It is, to use Daniel Dennett's terminology, epiphenomenal. Abhinava recognizes this as well. He tells us, consequently, when you separate off the effects of this creation, like the body, etc., then the state of doership does not occur, i.e., as the Samkhyas do when they separate off the Purusha from Prakriti. This type of relationship between cause and effect we have earlier refuted in great detail. And in this way, the material appearance of effects, which is just the world, bodies and stones, etc., is really just only what makes up the Purusha alone. As it is said in the Vedic scripture, i.e. the Rig Veda, the Purusha indeed is all this. This is from the famous Purusha Sukta. Purusha evedam sarvam iti. So Purusha, classically in Indian Samkhya philosophy, represents the idea of pure spirit consciousness, unchanging and untouched by the material world. As a category, Samkhya places it in opposition to nature and matter. In this respect, Purusha functions analogously to Descartes' res cogitans, mind in contrast to materiality, mind in contrast to matter. Abhinava, on the other hand, links causality to an idea of consciousness, rewriting the idea of consciousness as tied to the matter of the world. Thus, we have meaning and consciousness intrinsic to matter. Okay, so now for my conclusion here. Where does this leave us in terms of information? Does the smelly materiality of pheromones, measurable and quantifiable, point to nothing more than mindless information driving lima bean and wasp? I've argued that information is presented in the guise of matter, of materiality, precisely because it offers a way of objectifying our world, making it third person, measuring it in bits, making it manipulable, and making it external. At the same time, the abstractness of information promises transcendence, a timelessness surviving black holes and allowing Ray Kurzweil's Google tech dream of immortal uploaded consciousness. What makes information so useful as a concept is precisely its capacity to cross the bridge, to flip bivalently from matter to immateriality, even as most of our proponents of information, like Ray Kurzweil, and for instance, ignore this bivalency. To their credit, Tononi and Max Tegmark do not ignore this. They actually point it out when they say, when they point to a basic panpsychist model. As Wheeler's information theoretic from its, quote, immaterial source makes clear, information is used as a way of sidestepping the issue of consciousness while leaving room for a backdoor recovery, for meaning to emerge. Max Tegmark capitalizes on this bivalence with his, quote, conscious mathematical formulas. And I suggest a comparison with Abhinava's idea of the mantra, also drawing on a bivalency derived from the materiality of sound, and at the same time with its first-person perspective, which again gives rise to meaning. That's why sound is so special, because it connects to meaning, allowing us to bridge the gap between matter and matter in the mind and the consciousness. Okay, so meaning. In Wheeler's participatory universe, meaning points to the who of materiality. Wheeler steers clear of the implications of his participatory universe. We can, nevertheless, read Abhinava as spelling the implications out, namely that it entails a first-person perspective. In tandem, he proposes a somewhat radical suggestion that we relocate causality from the effects of matter on matter instead to the who of meaning. That is, Abhinava suggests that causality can only occur within a conscious subject, within conscious subjectivity. His panentheism leads us to one other remarkable proposal, a corollary that reverses our current thinking. There is no such thing as mindless information. My play on Wheeler's it from bit to it from chit means that consciousness never quite abandons matter. Even for a clay jar, consciousness is simply covered over. Abhinava's model suggests the fusion of subjectivity all through materiality. So this is this quote that he gives us earlier on, where he says, Niyabhavo hichid dharmas, which is that the state of being an object is only just the essence of, it's only just an attribute of consciousness. Tatchaya chadanayan natam, that can never be covered over. It's not possible. I actually think that first epigraph that I gave you, I think that there's a typo in there. So please ignore that typo. We'll have to fix it. In any case, for us humans and wasps and caterpillars, meaning, intentionality, in a word, a first-person perspective persists ensconced in matter. Yes, even so, with the grip of Maya, modulating various levels of freedom and awareness. So the god or goddess who has the mantra as body certainly has more capacity for freedom and awareness than I do in my matter ensconced body, and then the wasp or the lima bean plant does in their own matter ensconced bodies. In any case, Abhinava's hermetic application of his inherited cosmology, the tattva system, spells out the stages and varying levels, charting the mix of subject and object. So we are all a mix of subject and object. Some of us lean more heavily on the side of subject. Some of us, like gods, can sort of transcend to a large degree the idea of matter. This mix of subjectivity simultaneously with being an object is what it means to be human or wasp or lima bean or clay jar or God. What Abhinava brings then is a heightened attention to the crucial function that subjectivity plays and must play in any model of the world that we conjure. That is, what Abhinava can add to Wheeler's and other current formulations like that of Tegmark's is precisely to flesh out the implications this has for notions of subjectivity. The idea of meaning comes back into the picture. Even if we land eventually on the side of a biological determination driving much of what we and insects choose, perhaps Abhinava's panentheism can help us and help a new materialism as well to pause just long enough to complicate our assessment of ourselves and our planetary cohabitants, plants and insects. Not so long ago, Descartes could quite confidently declare with his famous analogy of the beast machine that animals, even dogs and pigs and chimpanzees, were mere automata, not conscious and not capable of feeling pain. The holism of Abhinava's panentheism proposes rather our non-separability from these others. As Abhinava describes genuine knowledge, the person who is said to be liberated is someone who correctly understands other beings to be like one's own limbs. It is only when we are under the sway of Maya that we think of others as separate, leaving us incapable of realizing the multiplicity of the world as our own self. Perhaps psychologically, in order for us to believe that our science is true, it needs to claim this cool objectivity, this third-person perspective, to understand its objects of study precisely as objects in the third person. Perhaps to gain mastery, we need to see these others, these dogs and chimpanzees as automata, and so we can operate on them in labs, etc. We need to see the transfer of pheromone information as an algorithmic mechanism. In contrast, the spotlight Abhinava's cosmology shines on the function of subjectivity affords a way of making space for the multiplicity of others, jars and plants, for feeling the pain of dogs and pigs and recognizing the symbiosis of pheromone conversation, in this case, happy for lima beans and deadly for caterpillars. This phenomenology of subjectivity is one that we might be able to use philosophically we might be able to use to philosophically underwrite the perspective of matter, its rights, even in the face of our current ecological maelstrom, in which our survival may depend on shifting our attitudes towards the matter of the earth. And it may help us as well to understand this craze for the idea of information and its bivalency. Okay, that's it. Thank you. Sorry about that typo in my first slide.
Thank you, Professor Biernacki, for this extremely interesting talk. Thank you so much. We are going to start the Q&A session, and we would like to call Alejandro to unmute yourself and ask your question, please.
How do I stop the share?
I think there's just a function there on the bottom that says stop sharing. Should be able to.
It says resume share. Okay, so this is good. Okay, I think we're good here. Great, okay.
There we go. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, well, thank you, Dr. Biernacki, for this very interesting talk. And there is so much to cover. I know I have an academic occupation myself, and I know that upon speaking for 1 hour and 15 minutes, you still feel that you didn't even touch the subject. But therefore, I don't blame you if you have that feeling. I just wanted to invite you to elaborate a little bit within the constraints of the time we have on a point that keeps coming up among whoever undertakes the study of Tantrism in general, Kashmiri Shaivism, and the philosophy of Abhinavagupta, and in general, all kind of Advaita non-dual thinking, which is substance dualism. So my question reads like this, although you address a lot of that, but I would like to invite you to elaborate as you feel needed. How does your proposed paradigm deal with substance dualism, a thesis that seems to permeate all religious thought, at least Judeo-Christian, but certainly Hindu in a remarkable degree, and stands out as one of the most sticky points between materialists, or I would suggest to say substance monists, which is the issue of the ghost in the machine, right? And traditional religion-centered thinkers.
Yeah.
And to that, I added a comment when you showed the slide about Maya-bound subjects, which is the quote about Maya-bound subjects suggests, at least in the phrasing of it, a differentiation between souls and bodies. How does this play in the context of this idea of a unified continuous information field? Thank you.
Yeah, great. So you're asking actually a couple of different questions here, which is nice. So basically, this the first part of this is that and you have part of the answer to the first part of it. You just gave it to us because we talked about, because you also mentioned Descartes. And substance dualism comes from Descartes. It's part of the sort of heritage of and I do talk about this in the book in much more depth in the book. So it's part of our Judeo. Maybe not everyone, but it's part of the Judeo-Christian heritage, this idea of a substance dualism, and Descartes just formulates that philosophically. Now, what happens with that is when he formulates it philosophically, it becomes a sort of stepping stone for an atheism to sort of take hold and erase the element of soul or spirit that you're talking to, and it leaves you with the sort of substance monism, materialism, physicalist materialism that pervades our world. Okay, so what we have in Abhinavagupta is a completely different model, really. Okay, the Indian religious traditions do not have a substance. Well, I mean, some do. Samkhya has a substance dualism, and that's why it's so easy to compare Samkhya to Descartes, and that's why Abhinavagupta's arguments work so well in our context today, because he's arguing against Samkhya, which, like our contemporary Cartesian model, has a substance dualism. So this is why Abhinav figures all of this out, because he has to push back against Samkhya and says, no, Samkhya is incorrect. Okay, so Abhinava's model is really different from a substance dualism. I mean, it's sometimes understood as a dual aspect monism, okay, and that dual aspect has a lot to do with ideas of you can trace the dual aspect to things like jnana and kriya, action, knowledge and action, and also to prakasha and vimarsha, the illustrious name of our wonderful sort of host here, Taneshwar at Vimarsha. Okay, so this is also a substance dualism. What makes Abhinava's substance dualism so much more intelligent and sophisticated than most substance dualisms that you find, and I'm thinking of different people, in the 4th chapter of my book, I think I go through a whole different series of different models of substance dualisms that have been adopted by folks who are trying to get out of the problem of our sort of Cartesian dualism, which you've pointed out. And so they come up with a lot of different substance dualist models, but most of them are not that great. Like David Bohm's is okay. It's not really that great, but there's a lot of different models out there. What makes Abhinava's model so wonderful and successful is precisely that he uses this idea of Vimarsha as this essence, going back to what I'm talking about with sound being sort of consciousness and meaning. He uses this as a way to connect consciousness via Vimarsha into materiality. And so he's erased the substance dualism problem. Okay. Now, to point to the second part, to point to the second part of your question, where you're talking about these the problems with souls and contemporary religions having souls, etc. Pretty much every religious tradition in India has this notion of something that's separate from the physical body. Like even the Buddhists, who don't even believe in souls, have this idea of a subtle body. Otherwise they can't explain reincarnation. Okay, so you've got a subtle body all the way through. Now, the subtle body is not actually the same as a sort of eternal soul. Okay, and that's what all of these Indian traditions make very clear from the very you may find it a little bit of this notion, say in Jainism, the Digambara tradition. Maybe they're sort of clinging to an idea of soul as an eternal reality. They're probably they and Samkhya are probably the only ones. Really, what happens is that you get this notion, the subtle body, and then for say Shankaracharya, for Abhinavagupta, you have consciousness is absolute, which takes form as a subtle body, and that subtle body then becomes ensconced in a material body when a person is born. Okay, makes use of that physical material body. So to think of this kind of substance dualism in term that you find in the West as being applicable to sort of Indian traditions on the whole, with a couple notable exceptions, Samkhya and Jainism, to think of it as being sort of similar is completely sort of misses the point of most Indian philosophy, and that is they're so much more sophisticated because they actually understand that the subtle body doesn't have to be an eternal reality. It actually just is this sort of expression of consciousness, and that's how the Buddhists can say, "Oh, no self, you can still have reincarnation," and that's how Abhinava says, like, "Oh yeah, you have this sort of subtle body, all these layers. Ultimately, will come the absolute, vis-a-vis as it travels up this chain, becoming a mantra, then a lord of mantras." This is in his, I'm just referring very obliquely here to Abhinavagupta's inherited notion of 7 layers of pramatras, 7 layers of subjects, okay? And some of us are sort of like, at this very low level, sakala, where we have physical bodies and we're pashus, we're sort of unenlightened, and then some of them, and then you can get up all the way to the level of Shiva. So that's 7 levels compared to like a Western model of 2, okay? A soul and a body. Okay, so you can see it's a much more sophisticated, much more replete model in terms of understanding the variations on what you can do with a subtle body. So I do hesitate to use the word soul because it's such a misleading term. It's a Western term and it's just misleading. And so I like, to think more about, consciousness, the subtle body, and then also the physical body. Now, and there are gradations of those as well. Obviously it's not in my paper here, but there's a wonderful quote elsewhere where Abhinava, it's in the book, I write about this in the book, where Abhinava talks about the subtle body, and he says that the subtle body is important because the subtle body is, with its connections, I think ultimately to Vimarsha and materiality, is what allows you to know the sort of the world as object as well. So in that sense, it's a wonderful quote that he gives, because we tend to think of this notion that matter is sort of lesser than consciousness, okay? And Abhinavagupta in then the quote elsewhere, he basically turns that idea on its head and says that all of this is absolutely consciousness. Consciousness is essentially imbued and within matter, and he basically does not prioritize some sort of bodiless consciousness transcendent state over a sort of embodied state. If you're very interested in this, I'll later on send me an email and I'll look up the quote for you. It's in my book. I talk about it in the book, so you'll find it. Yeah, but okay, so that's sort of what he does with this. Okay, so thanks for that really lovely in-depth question.
Thank you so much. So for the next question, I'd invite Rakesh Goel to speak, and I'm going to unmute you now, and you can ask the professor your question. Okay, Rakesh.
Thank you, Raviji, and very warm regards to Professor Biernacki for bringing keeping lecture.
Oh, I can't hear at all. Is it written down? Can you write it down in the chat or something? Because I can't hear this question, what you're saying. Maybe
Can you hear me?
Only vaguely. You're a little bit sort of muffled.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, there you go.
Okay, good. So my question, Professor Biernacki, is, would it be better to use the term dynamic information? By using dynamic information, you tie it much closer to energy, Shakti, because energy is the holder of information. Energy manipulates the Manani bits. Energy transmits the information. It also then enables you to segue into the bivalence problem, because in quantum energy has both wave and dual aspects to it. So you solve that. And with the notion of dynamic information, there is also, at the end of the day, I think Abhinav was not just concerned about matter and consciousness. Abhinav's starting point of empiricism was lok vyavhara, transactional activity. And so dynamic information sort of captures that. Am I just being technical, or is that helpful for me to understand what you are enlightening us on?
Okay, that's wonderful. That's really, really wonderful, Rakeshji. That's really wonderful. And what's wonderful about it, particularly, is that you're sort of taking like one of the things that has been talked about in terms of Abhinavagupta's philosophy, how it differs from, say, Shankaracharya's philosophy, is that it incorporates a dynamic element. Okay, and I'm thinking that that's where you're getting this notion of dynamism from, this sort of distinction that Abhinava's philosophy has in relationship to Shankara's philosophy. Okay, so that, and I think that makes a lot of sense. Now, the bivalency, I think, is both the dynamism comes from Abhinava's. It's already there precisely because, and this is also what you pointed out, I think, also this sort of loka vyavahara, this sort of like worldly transactional level. Abhinava is keen on keeping that in for many, many philosophical reasons and also for practical reasons as well. And that is what I think. That's exactly how I think you get the dynamism. It's because he actually sort of like makes it practical, and not just makes it practical. He actually making it practical means also that he connects the consciousness to matter. Okay, so now as far as the bivalency goes, that in terms of the term of information, that bivalency is in, like, I mean, I hope I pointed out clearly enough that bivalency is actually implicit in people like Wheeler. It's implicit in people like Ray Kurzweil. It's there. That's why they like the term information in the first place, because they need that bivalency. Because if Kurzweil didn't implicitly believe this bivalency was present, then he wouldn't be able to download his consciousness into a computer. It'd be just sort of like, ones and zeros on a computer information. And he won't acknowledge this because, like Wheeler, for the same reason Wheeler won't acknowledge this, because it takes away this sort of notion of an objective third person, which I think the essence of that is a desire for mastery. Okay, so in a sense, their use of information is actually sort of just another reiteration of sort of the, colonial imperialism, which is all about mastery over matter. Okay, it's all about mastery over matter, and that's why you adhere to the third person perspective. And Abhinava underwrites. He basically points out that doesn't make sense. Okay, and I'll connect it both to Indian philosophy, and I'll also connect it to sort of contemporary world too. And in terms of Indian philosophy, as you well know, Samkhya was associated with a long tradition of asceticism. And what is asceticism? And that's why it's connected also with Jainism as well. Jainism is probably, wonderfully so, one of the most ascetic traditions that exist. In really, like, you gotta, like, you have to respect the sort of, that is like, no matter what religion you follow, the Jains beat every religious tradition, I think, in terms of their capacity to sort of practice asceticism. It's bar none across the board, I think, Jainism and now the other side of that is that within Samkhya and Jainism, these ideas of make this separation, that's where you get these sort of heightened asceticism. And I think that heightened asceticism does precisely is to sort of generate a capacity for mastery. Okay, it's mastery over the body, mastery over the world. And this is precisely one of the things that Tantra traditions disrupt. When Tantra comes along, it says asceticism, mastery over the body, is not the way to get true enlightenment. Okay, it says asceticism, mastery over the body, is actually a counter to sort of any kind of true enlightenment. And that's why they bring the body back in. And I think you could also argue that that's why women become so important, because in this binary of spirit and matter, if you've got this hierarchy, spirit always wins out, matter is denigrated, that transfers on a gender level. Spirit is masculine, matter is feminine, and so spirit is better than masculine is better than feminine. And Tantra pushes back on that in a huge way, because it says that's not the way to get enlightened. So that, I think, is the essence of what's going on with this notion of information as well. It's just pretty much a colonial move to say we're going to stay on the level of the sort of on the level of the third person objective, and we can be transcendent. Okay, and so that's what but really it doesn't work, and they don't want to, like, Ray Kurzweil won't acknowledge it. It doesn't work. So to bring it back to sort of contemporary philosophy, this is what you see happening with, there are some really thoughtful neuroscientists and philosophers of mind, like people like Tononi, the neuroscientist Tononi, who are actually recognizing that, yes, it is the case that that you have to have consciousness there. You can't just information. The theory is integrated information technology, okay, and they're relying on this notion of information. But push comes to shove, Tononi has recognized that consciousness is essential to this whole project. So he and Max Tegmark, who is aligned with him, I think, is are both sort of saying like, no, it doesn't. The model doesn't work. This Cartesian mastery over information, it doesn't work. What you really need to do is you need to bring back in this idea of meaning, the back door. And so they're both acknowledging that as well. And in an article that I wrote, I actually critiqued Tononi, this neuroscientist, IT theory, saying that, look, you guys are talking about, you use this term, they have these 5 terms that they use where they talk about information, and one of them, integrated information, one of them is this term which they called intrinsicality. And I wrote an article where I critiqued this term. I said, you guys are using this obscure term intrinsicality, but what you really mean is you mean a first-person perspective. Like, that's what you mean. You mean what Abhinavagupta is talking about here with meaning, with subjectivity, with a first-person perspective. And to their credit, they changed their when the next iteration that they came out with the theory, they actually changed and they said, we're talking about subjectivity. Okay, and then some journals contacted me and said, "Hey, can you write about this?" So clearly they read our stuff, and science journals. So clearly they read the stuff, and they actually are responsive. So I'm not saying all science is like this, because some science you can see is actually aware of these problems, and they're sort of like understanding. In a sense, you could say. And when the article that I critiqued them, I actually drew on Abhinavagupta to say, "Look, let's call a spade a spade. You're talking about a first-person perspective," and they sort of agreed. And not even sort of, they absolutely agreed and changed the way they talk about it. So I think that the bivalency is there, whether you like it or not, whether they like it or not, it's there. It's just whether they acknowledge it or not. Otherwise, their whole venture is useless. Like, Ray Kurzweil will never be able to upload his consciousness into a computer if he doesn't have the subjectivity connected to this notion of information. Yeah, wonderful question. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I'm buying your book right after this talk.
Max will be happy. Okay.
Thank you. I think we have time for 2 more questions. We would like to call Anand Vaidya to unmute yourself, please.
Okay. Can you hear me okay? Hi, Loriliai.
Now we can't hear you. Now we can't hear you.
What about now?
Yeah,
Good?
okay.
Good, yeah. So thank you for a wonderful talk and an excellent book. I loved reading it. I think it's wonderful. I think your talk explores a lot of interesting connections. There's a lot of questions I could ask, so I'm going to go with like 3 high-level questions that you could then fill out in different ways.
Start with one. Let's do one at a time, okay? Let's just do one.
Okay, well, yeah, we're going to do one at a time. Don't worry, they're slow. They're very simple. So the first one is just whether or not the Wheeler sort of interpretation depends on collapse interpretations in physics as opposed to non-collapse interpretations because of the use of the notion of a participant. And so in some ways, I wondered if you were a many worlds theorist, you might think, I'm not really getting the significance of why I'm forced into this camp of thinking of the participant. And so that's kind of like, just the real thing is like, I mean, I don't think it affects things terribly, but maybe there's like just a relationship between which way someone might go there.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So, I mean, to answer that question, then, I mean, Wheeler's notion of the collapse is actually, of course, what the sort of what he talks what the quote that I gave you, where he's talking about millenniums of questions back and forth. That is, of course, the notion of the collapse. And so Wheeler is not a many worlds.
Right.
I've looked at the many worlds hypothesis in great detail. It really holds water. And what I've also read is that a number of contemporary physicists are saying that many worlds theorem is it's fancy, it's fun, but it doesn't necessarily, there's no way to prove it. It's not scientific because you can't actually prove it. Okay. So it's not even a useful scientific hypothesis because, it defies the sort of main scientific, rule of can you actually sort of demonstrate it to be either true or false? So basically what I want to do is like Wheeler, I would discount a sort of many worlds from the get-go. However, given the question as it is, I don't think it's that material as either to the notion of whether or not you need meaning. You still have the whole problem of needing to bring meaning into it. It still involves the necessity for the subject as a first person perspective. So even if so on two levels. First level, person following Wheeler, I don't think the theory is correct, but even if you accept the theory, it still doesn't it's still not that relevant to the, as you, I think, already noted, it's not that relevant to the problem at hand. It's just a minor sort of like tangent on, oh, well, does it work or does it not work kind of deal. That it's not really relevant to the question of whether you can do something objectively without a first person, without an intentionality behind it. Yeah.
So that folds nicely into the second question, which is, in your talk and in your book, I noticed that sometimes you don't make explicit a distinction that many people would make, which is between an information theoretic model of a phenomenon phi, or F, and information being what F is, the identity claim. So some of the people who make claims about information, like even in your book, you talk about Shannon. Like Shannon makes an is claim and he defines out meaning right away from the beginning, which you then argue nicely is a mistake for him. And you draw into how IIT modifies that, which is very good. But I think it's generally useful to say that someone could be interested in the project of giving an information theoretic model of F without saying that F is information, and that it's useful to think that way because it helps us to engage in certain sort of predictive processing models of what's going on an approach from an information theory. So I wonder, is some of the problem here that some of the people you're dealing with are really only giving information theoretic models and not really giving information is claims, or you think they're all in the same camp of giving information is claims?
No, so what I'm saying is what I said in the paper, basically, which is basically that, sure, you can do that, but what's driving that? Ultimately, what's driving that is, what Wheeler is doing, which is like he's afraid to say the word consciousness. Now, why? Why can't he not sort of go there? He himself points out that that's where all of his argument leads, but he can't make that extra step. Why can he not do it? Why does he want to stay in an information theoretic model? The reason is because he wants this sort of power, the mastery, i.e., it's a colonial imperialist move. He wants the mastery that comes from a third person perspective. That's what I think that if you look closely, that's what it boils down to. They want the sort of the mastery, the power, the sort of transcendent sort of status where they cannot be sort of like connected to the materiality. I think it's just a psychological move that many of these people make, and they make that psychological move for a very good reason. They make it because it allows them a certain kind of cultural authority. That's my reading of that, okay? Now, and it's true, you're right, you can do that. You totally can do that, okay? And a lot of scientists do like to do that. And we have to be mindful of the fact, why are they doing that? Okay, and I think that is a sort of the crux of the matter, and that's why I really deeply, deeply respect a scientist, a neuroscientist like Tononi. Now, he went there in the beginning of their theory. They did exactly the same thing. They left it in this model, and then but the logic of the theory forced them to sort of start to have to recognize that, yeah, we have to include this. But even then they didn't want to do it. They just didn't. So they come up with these obscure words like intrinsicality, so they can hide the fact that a first person perspective was actually intrinsic to the issue. They tried to, why did they do that? For a very good reason, because you and all of us, we're in a world right now that's governed by a Western Western quote scientific objective model, and we too are being sort of forced to we got to play their game if we want to get ahead. And I think that's what's happening with a lot of scientists. So I have the utmost respect for these neuroscientists who actually decided that calling a spade, sort of laying out what they're really doing in explicit fashion telling the truth was more important than sort of like sticking with this model of this sort of, and it's true, you have to do that in our world. There's no doubt about it, so it takes a lot of courage to do what they did, but that's, this is where we are. But so what I'm saying here with this as well, and this, I can't help but think of Rakeshji's wonderful point about how loka vyavahara, that, that the philosophy that we do is also intimately connected with the politics that we are embedded in. Okay. And so, and I think that's something we should not lose sight of, that, because that's what I think, a lot of philosophy has done just that. It sort of loses sight of the fact that that we are humans embedded in a physical, in a sort of political world that sort of demands certain allegiances from us, and that that those allegiances don't necessarily have to do with what we think is true, but have more to do with the dynamics of power and discourse.
Okay, very short last one on consciousness. In your book, you point out some relationships between IIT and Abhinavagupta, and I think I just wanted a clarification, because IIT gives sort of like a degree theoretic account of panpsychism, and I thought Abhinavagupta was maybe more cosmopsychist. Do you think there's more of is there some subtlety there that you could fill out the detail on?
Yeah, no, that's good. I actually have a whole article, 2 articles out that in the book. I don't talk that much about IIT. I only talk a little bit about here and there, but I actually, if you're interested, I actually have 2 articles
Yes.
on Abhinavagupta comparing his ideas to IIT. Yeah, so 2 separate articles where I talk in way more detail about the differences and the similarities. And you're right, they're not quite the same. Abhinava has a slightly different perspective, and it is the case that if anything, Tononi is going to, and IIT 3.0, 4.0 is going to lead, even though it's panpsychist, it's going to lead more towards a micro panpsychism, whereas Abhinava is really clear. It's cosmopsych, like in Goff's terms, it's a cosmopsychism, and so there are some differences. There are some important differences, and there are some sort of weak points in that Abhinava's theory. I mean, obviously, I'm deeply enamored of Abhinavagupta, and there are some theories where I'm still puzzling over, like, well, how does he really get around this particular problem? That is, the opposite of the decombination problem instead of the combination problem, the opposite of the combination of the decombination problem, which is a problem that I'm still not really clear. How does Abhinava really get around this problem? How does in other words, to make that more explicit for people who are not familiar with that terminology, how is it that pure consciousness, chit, shakti, how is it that she, and I use this quote in my book, I talk about this, how is it that consciousness, pure consciousness, which is the absolute containing the holism of everything, how is it that she can lose her innate awareness and knowledge to become a clay jar, to become us, become these clearly limited beings? Now, the answer that's given is svatantriya, freedom, as the way that pure consciousness, Shiva, the goddess, Shakti, does this, but it's not entirely satisfying to me at this point, but maybe someone can really enlighten me on that. How can you make that particular answer satisfying on a sort of straight up logical level? Freedom, I mean, I buy it, sure, freedom, but how, But yeah, so that's a good question, and that's completely correct. I think that Abhinav is a cosmopsychist, whereas Tononi is going to lean more towards a sort of micro-panpsychist.
All right, I look forward to reading your 2 other papers. Thank you very much, Loriliai.
Yeah, thanks, Alan.
Thank you so much, Professor. We're mindful that we're a little bit over time, so we're wondering if you have to leave or if we have time for 2 more questions in our queue.
I'll have time for 2 more questions, but can I take a little break and run to the bathroom?
Yes, please.
So I'm going to just sort of mute myself. Okay, unfortunately, I don't have a body simply made of mantra and sound. I'm made of earth and water and all those problems that come with that.
So our next question will come from Firas Ahmedi, and I'll unmute you now.
Hi. So thank you for all that. I do want to change my question from the one I wrote down, if you don't mind. My question to you is, how do we, maybe this is too big a question. How do we overcome this epistemology that refuses to take into account the perceiver and only wants to take into account the information that the perceiver receives? So how do we overcome that?
Oh, that is such a fantastic question. I mean, that is such a really, really good question. I mean, from my own perspective, I think that any kind of contemplative practice, like mantra practice, will actually sort of help facilitate that. Because I think at any time one starts to become aware of the self, or even also Brahmana Maharshi type of practice. Who am I? I think that contemplative practice of any sort will be helpful. But really, you're asking probably the most important question that there is. And what's your answer? I wish I had a really good answer, and I'm not sure I do. So but I have to say that I think your question is probably the single most important question that we have. So if you have an answer that you're thinking, or anybody does, please let me know. Like, seriously, what's your answer?
I mean, honestly, I don't have an answer, but I wish I did. So.
I wish I did too. I did too. But it probably is the single most important question, actually. So thank you very much for that question. We should broadcast it out. Yeah.
Okay, and the last question was actually one I had that I was thinking about as you were presenting, and my mind was going a lot to the theory of the 7 Paramatras. And I was thinking a lot about your initial slide of Richard Dawkins and kind of the claim that, well, all you yogi people, you just cling to the God of the gaps, right? When there's something that's not explainable through science, you then pull in your Jesus or your Shiva or your whatever. And I was wondering, kind of the way that you talk about the subject, well, there's not just one subject, right? There are these multiple different subjects. And I wonder if, based on the theory of the 7 perceivers, there would be almost like a programmatic way to explain where different types of scientific inquiry break down based on the limits of the perceivers. So for instance, there's this stuff, we don't know what happened before the Big Bang, right? Well, wouldn't that be the Pralayakala Pramata, right? Wouldn't that be explainable in that sort of way? And so I was wondering if you could kind of talk about whether the theory of the 7 perceivers explains where there might be limits to the types of positivist science we do, and whether there might not be sort of fundamentally different types of science that are available to people who are able to ascend, because he talks about these different ways of ascending, the vidhi of how you ascend up. And so are there different types of science for people who have access to higher levels of subjectivity? Can we explain the limits of certain types of positive science based off of these models? I'm curious if you have any thoughts.
I mean, I think that is a really great idea, in my opinion. I mean, I hadn't really thought about that at all in writing this book or working on other things of Abhinavagupta. But I think that you're onto something really quite useful there. That in fact, the level of the pramatra really determines what you can perceive, and i.e. determines the kind of science you can do as well. So I think that's really, really spot on what you're proposing. I myself have not looked deeply into how we might categorize different sort of practices of science on these in terms of these different sort of levels of perceivers. But I think that you could do that, and I think it makes a lot of sense. Yeah, that's really wonderful. Excellent question. I think it makes quite a lot of sense, actually. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
Professor Biernacki, would you have time for just one more question, the last one?
Sure, I do. I absolutely do. Yeah.
Thank you. Lisa, can you unmute yourself, please?
Dr. Biernacki, thank you so much for your talk. I've been enjoying your book for the last year, and I've written a very positive review about it. So my question is about, you briefly mentioned Maya, and this further question that was asked about, how can Vimarsha, hide itself and not know something. And I'm wondering, like, what about, if you could say more about this power that consciousness has to hide itself? And if that's related somehow to this, ability to remember, the freedom to remember is also the freedom to forget. Is this related to like the covering up of consciousness that, of Shiva's power, like Gnana Smriti Pohana, that hiding part of Pohana being like, the kind of reverse of like
Yeah.
memory.
Yeah, no, I think that is actually quite astute to point this out. I mean, I think that that's exactly what's going on. It's a power, it's a freedom that consciousness has to also, it's the freedom of remembering, but also as you sort of very astutely point out, it's the freedom of forgetting as well too. And I think that is essentially what consciousness does. Consciousness forgets that it actually is the absolute, and how does it do that? I mean, this is the one, the one part of Abhinava's theory that I still scratch my head on, but why, would consciousness sort of limit itself in this way? Sure, we can say it's freedom. It does it out of its freedom. It does it out of lila, this desire for play, and those are maybe, sufficient as answers, but I for some reason, I want something a little bit more, as an answer to that particular, I mean, so it's interesting. You're coming up the same, question that I have, reading through Abhinava's philosophy, like, how does this, why would consciousness sort of do that to itself? I mean, it's true. Like, so, and what's wonderful about Abhinava is that almost everything that he does, you can always sort of think about all the kinds of philosophies that he sort of presents as working on a sort of the level of a very practical, ordinary, everyday level. And so one of the things I've done with Abhinava all through my readings of him is bring it back to like, well, how would this work on a sort of a visceral, physical level? Okay, and because that's one of the things that you see happening over and over with Abhinava. So with this question, it's a good one to think about as well too. Is it indeed the case that, like, how would we, how do we forget things? And we sometimes choose to forget things, but how is it that we actually sort of choose to forget? To make ourselves smaller and not now. And one example would be like if you're playing, say, with a little kid. Okay, then you cover up your own sort of knowledge and power simply so you can sort of enact in the game with a child. Okay, so that goes back to the idea of lila, goes back to the idea of svatantriya. So I'm still not entirely satisfied with that answer, but part of me is like, well, maybe that's the analogy I can use to sort of understand, why would consciousness make itself smaller? Okay, yeah, I mean, I don't have a good answer on that one. I don't really have a good answer. I'm going to think more about it though. And yeah, maybe I'll get your email. If I come up with anything else, I'll email you, let you know. But if you have an answer, let me know as well too. Because like, why in the world would we sort of make ourselves smaller? I mean, we do that, it's true, but we don't do it readily, as at least I as a human being to try not to do that readily. Sometimes it just sort of seems to happen, and I'm under the grip of the force of a lower pramatra matter sort of moving in its way, and so it just happens. But how would the divine actually choose to do this? Yeah, it's a wonderful question. One I'm still struggling with, scratching my head about, like, freedom. Yeah, I get it, but really, how? Yeah, thank you. That's a really good. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Professor Biernacki, all of you who joined us today. I would just like to close by inviting you to our second talk that is coming up in 2 weeks. We'll continue to explore the topic of new materialism within the world of Tantric Shaktism with Dr. Anway Mukhopadhyay. So if you will receive the information through an email if you have registered for the series. Acharya Ji, if you would like to say some closing words, please.
निराशंसात् पूर्णादहमिति पुरा भासयति यत् द्विशाखामाशास्ते तदनु च विभक्तुं निजकलाम् स्वरूपादुन्मेष प्रसरण निमेष स्थितिजुष Tadadvaitam Vande Paramashiva Shaktyatmanikhilam. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you for that lovely shloka. Okay. Okay. Thank you, guys. To be continued. Yeah.